Good morning. My name is Dimitri, my mentor is Eamon, and this is Distance Matters. The goal of our project was to explore the effect that distance has on knowledge transferred between a source academic paper and an author citing that paper, where where knowledge and influence were simply gauged based on survey responses that authors filled out, based on surveys that Eamon sent to thousands of authors, where they simply indicated knowledge conferred and influence conferred on a scale of 1 through 5, with 5 being the greatest. At the crux of the project was the notion of how we measure distance. It's either physical distance, cultural distance, such as differences in language, and also political distance, such as, two papers being written in different countries. So the most rudimentary notion was physical distance. That simply we plotted the source and target papers, their locations, and then determined the geometric distance between them. In terms of cultural and language distance, we looked at the languages spoken in the countries in which the source and the target papers were written, and then looked to see if there was any overlap between those. In terms of distance, in terms of political boundaries or other types of borders, we used the spatial app PostGIS to plot the locations of the source and target papers, draw a straight line between them, and see the number of international or U.S. state borders crossed by those straight lines and see if there was any effect. We also looked at geographic distance in the sense of, are the papers written in the same city, the same country, or even the same institution or university? Ultimately, we saw that geographic distance certainly matters. Increased physical distance was associated with greater levels, or with lesser levels of knowledge and influence conferred, and that effect was especially pronounced when we looked at the binary variable of whether or not the papers were from the same institution. If you look at the charts on the right, you can see that effect, because knowledge and influence both drop off incredibly steeply as distance first begins to increase, suggesting that early effect comes from them no longer being at the same institution, and then peters out a little bit, although the effect does still persist with increased distance. And we see the same effect for political and cultural notions of distance as well. Then we wanted to look at a slightly more sophisticated notion of distance by evaluating how far apart the knowledge practices or the subject areas are between the source and the target papers. For this, we used word vectors and word embedding using a process called continuous bag of words, which characterizes the doc2vec and the word2vec Python libraries. In this process, the model generates a vocabulary based on all the source and target papers that are passed in, and using that vocabulary for each word in each paper, it generates a word vector where each component is a word in the vocabulary. The value of the component is the probability that each word in the vocabulary would appear within 2 spaces in a sentence of that word. Then from there, it generates a vector for each document. That would be the doc2vec process. And in order to train the model, we first tokenized the abstracts by separating the sentences into individual tokens, and then normalizing the tokens by removing capitalization as well as things like pronouns and proper nouns, and then feeding it into the model. Then we determined distance using the cosine similarities between the vectors associated with each abstract. And here we saw the same results. Knowledge and influence went up significantly at greater levels of proximity and similarity. Next steps would be looking at temporal distance, such as the difference between the 2 dates that the source and target papers were written. And then in terms of real-world takeaways, we saw that an increased distance leads to less influence conferred by a source paper. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, in which scientists can't really work in the same institution or in the same building, especially somewhere in the United States where the pandemic is so prolonged, that could be potentially very pernicious on scientific research, and scientific research could potentially be slowed down or made less profound because of this. So this was Distance Matters, and thank you very much for listening.